My father threw the gray suitcase at my feet in the middle of the bus station and told me not to come home. My mother stood beside him with dry eyes, while my little sister smiled from the back seat of the car like she had just won a prize. 10 years later, I stood behind tinted glass on the top floor of a Boston Harbor Convention Hall, watching those same 3 people drift through my charity gala in rented elegance, pretending they still belonged among powerful people. Richard Whitmore tugged at the collar of a tuxedo that pinched his aging neck. Elaine Whitmore lifted her chin with the brittle pride of a woman terrified someone might see the cracks beneath her pearls. Sophie, my golden child sister, glittered in a silver gown she could not afford, scanning the room as if searching for a throne. They had no idea the building belonged to me. They had no idea every lender choking my father's dying company answered to one hidden owner. Me. I rested one hand on the handle of the old gray suitcase beside my heel. The fabric was faded, the zipper broken, the corner scraped raw from the morning my father shoved it into my hands. That suitcase was supposed to be the symbol of my exile. Tonight, it would become the evidence of my resurrection. But before I tell you how I became the woman who owned the room my parents were desperate to enter, I need to take you back to the morning I turned 18. There was no birthday cake. No candles. No card with my name written in careful ink. Only cold rain sliding down the windows of my father's black sedan as he drove through Charlotte before sunrise, his jaw locked so tight it looked carved from stone. My mother sat in the passenger seat, dabbing perfume behind her ears as if she were preparing for brunch, not abandoning her daughter. Sophie lounged in the back beside me, scrolling through her phone, her glossy lips curling whenever she thought I was not looking. The Greyhound station smelled of wet concrete, burnt coffee, and cheap floor cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, turning everyone's skin pale and tired. My father pulled the gray suitcase from the trunk and dropped it onto the pavement. The wheels cracked against the curb. "Take it, Clara," he said. His voice held no tremor. No regret. Just the clipped tone he used when dismissing workers from his construction sites. I looked at the suitcase, then at the envelope he pressed into my hand. Inside was a one-way bus ticket to Harrow Bay, Maine. I had never been to Maine. I barely knew where Harrow Bay was. "This is your birthday gift," he said, leaning close enough that I could smell coffee and bitterness on his breath. "We are done wasting money on you. We only have room to invest in someone with a real future." Behind him, Sophie lowered her phone just long enough to watch my face break. Elaine finally looked at me. For one fragile second, I thought my mother might soften. I thought something human might surface in her eyes. Instead, she adjusted the sleeve of her cream coat and whispered, "Do not make this harder than it needs to be." Something inside me went silent. I did not beg. I did not cry. Tears had never saved me in that house. Tears only gave Sophie something to imitate later for sympathy. I dragged the suitcase toward the station doors. The handle bit into my palm. My sneakers splashed through a shallow puddle, soaking my socks. Just as I stepped beneath the awning, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. A credit monitoring alert flashed across the cracked screen. "Happy 18th birthday. Your adult credit file is now available." I opened it. My breath stopped. More than $160,000 in debt glared back at me. Credit cards. Personal loans. Equipment financing. All opened under my name before I was old enough to legally sign anything. All maxed out. All poisoned. The truth struck with brutal clarity. My parents were not sending me away because I had disappointed them. They were sending me away because I had become old enough to discover what they had stolen. 2 days earlier, Sophie had accused me of stealing her bracelet. My father tore through my room like a storm, ripped open drawers, lifted my mattress, and found a planted envelope of cash. My mother called me corrupted. Sophie stood behind her shoulder, smiling with those bright innocent eyes she used on everyone else. I had tried to explain. I had proof I was at the library. Nobody cared. They never needed the truth. They needed a villain. Now I understood why. As the bus engine growled outside, I reached into my coat pocket and felt the small brass key I had hidden there for years. I had found it as a child in a box of old family papers, stamped with 3 words my father once cursed under his breath. Whitmore Dock 7. He told me my grandmother Eleanor died poor and forgotten. He told me there was nothing left of her but dust and debt. That was the first lie that would destroy him. I climbed onto the bus with a broken suitcase, a stolen future, and a key to a life I did not yet understand. My parents thought they had sent me to the edge of nowhere. They had no idea they were sending me straight to the one woman powerful enough to make me untouchable. The bus rolled into Harrow Bay beneath a sky the color of old steel. Rain had turned to mist, thin and cold, drifting across the windows like ghostly fingers. I pressed my forehead against the glass and watched the town appear in fragments. A row of weather-beaten shops. A church steeple cutting through fog. Fishing boats rocking against black water. Farther beyond, huge cranes rose over the harbor like sleeping giants. My father had called it a dying town. He was wrong. Even through the fog, I could feel movement here. Trucks growled along the waterfront. Men in reflective jackets guided containers beneath yellow lights. Forklifts beeped in the distance. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and something sharper, something alive. This was not a graveyard. This was a machine. I stepped off the bus with my gray suitcase dragging behind me. The broken wheel scraped the pavement with a sound that made people turn and stare. My phone was nearly dead. My stomach cramped from hunger. My coat was too thin for main wind, and every breath felt like swallowing glass. I expected no one. Then I saw her. A woman stood beneath the station awning, perfectly still while the mist curled around her black wool coat. She looked to be in her 50s, with silver threaded through dark hair twisted into a severe knot. Her posture was straight, almost military. In one gloved hand, she held a cream-colored card with my name printed across it. Clara Whitmore. I stopped walking. The woman lowered the card. Her eyes moved over my wet hair, my cheap coat, the suitcase with its split seam. She did not pity me. That frightened me more than kindness would have. "You are Clara," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I answered, tightening my grip on the suitcase handle. "Who are you?" "Miriam Vale. Chief Legal Counsel for Whitmore Maritime Trust." The words hit me like a language I almost understood but could not translate. Whitmore Maritime Trust. My father had said the Whitmore name was buried under lawsuits and unpaid taxes. He said Harrow Bay held nothing but a condemned shack and a dead woman's debts. My father said there was nothing here, I whispered. Miriam's mouth curved, not quite a smile. Richard Whitmore has always confused his lies with reality. Before I could respond, she reached for my suitcase. I pulled it back on instinct. She paused, then nodded once, as if respecting the reflex. "Keep it if you need to," she said. "But come with me before this weather gets into your bones." Outside the station, a black SUV waited at the curb, polished so deeply the harbor lights slid across its surface. A driver opened the rear door. Warm air rushed out, smelling faintly of leather and cedar. I climbed in, stiff with suspicion, clutching the suitcase against my knees like it contained my entire life. Miriam sat beside me and opened a leather folder. "Your parents put you on that bus this morning because your adult credit file became visible today," she said. My throat closed. "You know about the debt?" "I know about the credit cards, the personal loans, the equipment financing, and the construction account opened using your identity. I also know Richard believed distance would make you powerless." The SUV turned away from the station and followed a road along the harbor. Fog broke in silver ribbons. Beyond a line of iron fencing, floodlights revealed rows of containers, warehouses, refrigeration units, and ships resting at private docks. On one gate, bronze letters gleamed through the mist. Whitmore Maritime. My pulse stumbled. "This is not a shack," I said. "No," Miriam replied. "This is what your father was never allowed to touch." The gates opened before we reached them. We drove through slowly, past workers who nodded at the SUV, past offices glowing with late-night activity, past a pier where a cargo ship sat loaded under swinging lights. At the top of a rocky rise stood a sprawling coastal house built of gray stone and dark wood, facing the angry Atlantic like it had been daring storms to come closer for 100 years. The car stopped. On the front terrace, beneath a copper lantern, an elderly woman waited in a motorized wheelchair. A thick navy blanket covered her legs. Her white hair was pinned neatly back. Her face was lined, proud, and unreadable. But her eyes stopped me cold. They were my eyes. Miriam stepped aside. I walked toward the terrace, the suitcase bumping behind me. The woman lifted one hand. In it was an old photograph of a little girl with tangled brown hair and serious eyes, sitting on a dock with a brass key around her neck. Me. Your father told me you were dead, I said, my voice shaking despite every effort to control it. Eleanor Whitmore looked at me for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was low, rough, and steady as the sea wall below us. Your father has been burying stronger women than himself for a very long time. He simply forgot that buried things sometimes grow roots. The wind struck the terrace, cold and wild. I stood there, soaked, hungry, and betrayed, staring at the grandmother who was supposed to be a ghost. Behind her stretched an empire of steel, salt, ships, and law. Behind me waited a past full of theft and lies. For the first time that day, I stopped feeling abandoned. I had not been thrown away. I had been delivered. Eleanor did not hug me when I arrived. She did not cry over the daughter of her son, did not call me poor child, did not wrap me in the soft blanket of pity I secretly wanted and fiercely feared. She studied me under the copper porch light, her pale eyes cutting through the rain, and said one sentence that changed the temperature of my life. If you want to survive the people who made you, Clara, you must become harder to use. That night, I slept in a guest room larger than my entire bedroom in Charlotte. The windows faced the black Atlantic. Waves crashed against the rocks below, thunderous and endless, like the sea was trying to break the house apart and failing. I lay awake beneath heavy quilts, staring at the ceiling, unable to trust the warmth, the clean sheets, the locked door. My old gray suitcase sat in the corner like a wounded animal. Every time I looked at it, I saw my father's hand dropping it onto wet pavement. At dawn, Eleanor sent Miriam to wake me. Breakfast was not pancakes and comfort. It was black coffee, toast, and a leather binder thick enough to bruise the table. Eleanor waited in her wheelchair at the head of the dining room, a silver pen resting between her fingers. Your father stole your name because he believed names were tools, she said. Today you start learning what your name actually owns. The binder contained maps of the harbor, cargo schedules, warehouse leases, insurance contracts, fuel agreements, and ledgers filled with numbers that looked like another language. My first instinct was panic. Richard had spent years making me feel small, slow, permanently in the way. Sophie was the sparkling one. I was the mistake who folded laundry quietly and apologized for breathing too loudly. Eleanor saw the fear cross my face. Do not shrink at the sight of power, she said. Power is just responsibility with better paperwork. So I learned. Morning by morning, the port became my classroom. I stood beside foremen while cranes groaned over steel containers. I watched refrigeration units hum through the night, protecting millions in seafood shipments. I learned why one delayed truck could bleed thousands of dollars, why one vague contract clause could swallow a company whole, why weak men loved loud promises and strong women trusted signed documents. Miriam taught me law with the patience of a blade being sharpened. She showed me how Richard had forged Eleanor's signature years earlier to secure his first construction loan. She showed me the account trails, the fake guarantees, the desperate refinancing that followed. Then she showed me my own stolen credit file. Page by page, until the anger in my chest stopped burning wild and began turning cold. Evidence is grief with a spine, Miriam told me. Keep it organized. I enrolled at a university in Boston with Eleanor's backing, studying finance and data analytics while working remotely for the trust. I did not go to parties. I did not chase popularity. I had seen what vanity did to Sophie. It made her expensive, hollow, and helpless. Instead, I spent nights building models that predicted shipping delays, tracing shell companies, and learning how distressed debt moved quietly from one desperate hand to another. Years passed with brutal discipline. Reports from Charlotte arrived every quarter. Richard's construction company was collapsing under bad loans and worse pride. Elaine still hosted charity luncheons with borrowed money, smiling beside women who would abandon her the second poverty touched her hem. Sophie dropped out of art school and reinvented herself online as a lifestyle creator, posing in clothes bought on credit, selling confidence she had never earned. Once, a photograph of Sophie appeared in Miriam's folder. She was laughing in a rooftop bar, champagne raised high, my mother's diamond bracelet glittering on her wrist. The same bracelet she had accused me of stealing. For a moment, the old pain moved in me. Then Eleanor tapped the folder shut. "Do not stare too long at people drowning in shallow water," she said. "They will mistake your attention for a rescue." In my final year at university, Eleanor's health began to fail. The woman who had seemed carved from granite grew thinner, quieter, but never weaker. We moved her medical bed into the harbor office so she could still hear the cranes and the ship horns. I sat beside her every evening, reading acquisition reports aloud while machines breathed softly near the window. One night, she placed the brass key to Dock 7 in my palm. "Your father thought blood made him heir," she whispered. "He never understood inheritance is not blood. It is capacity." Her fingers tightened around mine. "You have it." She died before sunrise, as fog rolled in from the Atlantic and covered the harbor in white silence. I did not break. I wanted to. But there were signatures waiting, employees watching, ships moving, storms forming. Grief walked beside me, clean and terrible, while I stepped into Eleanor's office and sat in her chair. Because of Miriam's hidden legal work, there was no battle over the trust. No delay. No open door for Richard. At 22, I became the sole controlling heir of Whitmore Maritime Trust. The girl abandoned at a bus station had not vanished. She had become the owner of the Tide. By the time I returned to Boston at 28, the city did not feel like a place I was entering. It felt like a room that had been prepared for me. Glass towers rose above the harbor, catching the morning light in hard silver planes. Ferries cut white lines across the dark water. Container ships moved slowly in the distance, obedient to schedules my company helped control. I stood inside my new headquarters on the 40th floor, looking down at the city that once would have terrified the girl with the broken suitcase. Now, entire boardrooms went quiet when I walked in. Whitmore Maritime Trust had grown beyond shipping. We owned cold storage facilities, port-adjacent real estate, freight technology, and silent stakes in companies Richard Whitmore begged to impress. I had also launched the Lighthouse Fund, a legal and housing foundation for young adults whose identities had been stolen by the very families meant to protect them. Every grant we issued felt like taking one more brick from the prison I had escaped. I did not mention Richard, Elaine, or Sophie in interviews. I did not have to. People who knew our family history heard the truth between every polished sentence. Then the first letter arrived. It came in a cream envelope, thick and expensive, addressed in my mother's looping handwriting. Elaine wrote that time had softened old misunderstandings. She wrote that difficult choices had been made during a stressful period. She wrote that a mother's heart never stops reaching for her child. She did not write bus station. She did not write stolen credit. She did not write sorry. I placed the letter on my glass desk and felt nothing warm move inside me. A minute later, my phone lit with a message request from Sophie. She claimed she had always admired my strength. She said our parents had created pressure on both of us. She called herself my little sister, as though those two words could erase the way she smiled while my life was being packed into a suitcase. Miriam entered my office just as I closed the message. "They have seen the magazine cover," she said. I turned toward her. "Richard is out of cash." His company missed 2 payroll cycles. His house is overleveraged. His commercial loans were sold last month. I already knew the next part before she said it. We bought them, I whispered. Miriam's smile was small and sharp. Through 3 holding companies. He believes his debt belongs to a regional investment group. I looked past her, through the windows, at the harbor glittering below. My father had once owned my fear. Now I owned his roof, his business, his deadlines, and every lie he still believed would save him. We could liquidate him before dinner, Miriam said. No, I replied. If he loses everything in private, he will blame the economy. He will blame banks, interest rates, bad partners, cruel timing. He will never understand that consequences have a face. Miriam studied me, waiting. So I gave them a door. 3 weeks later, invitations went out for the Lighthouse Fund annual gala at Boston Harbor Convention Hall. The guest list included philanthropists, investors, journalists, judges, and technology executives. I had 3 premium passes printed for Richard, Elaine, and Sophie Whitmore. Embossed. Gold-edged. Impossible for people like them to resist. Then I added the bait. Inside their invitation folder, I placed a wrinkled internal memorandum on Whitmore letterhead. It described a fictional executive search for a vice president of brand influence. No degree required. Strong social media presence preferred. Starting salary in the 6 figures. Equity package included. At the bottom, in careful language designed to feed vanity, I wrote that Sophie Whitmore appeared uniquely aligned with the company's new public image. It was not a promise. It was a mirror. Narcissists rarely question reflections that flatter them. On the evening of the gala, rain brushed the harbor windows and chandeliers burned above polished floors. I stood on the private balcony overlooking the ballroom. My old gray suitcase rested beside me, preserved but unrepaired. Below, Boston's elite moved in soft waves of silk, wool, perfume, and ambition. Then they arrived. Richard stepped through the entrance first, forcing his shoulders wide inside a rented tuxedo. Elaine clung to his arm, smiling too brightly, her eyes hungry for witnesses. Sophie followed in a silver gown that flashed under the lights, already scanning the room for cameras. They believed they had been invited back into my life. They believed Sophie was about to be crowned. They believed I was still the abandoned girl desperate to buy a family with forgiveness. Security let them enter the main floor and nothing more. When Richard tried to reach the executive lounge, 2 guards stopped him with quiet precision. When Sophie demanded champagne in a private suite, a waiter politely directed her to the public bar. I watched their confidence crack in tiny, delicious lines. Then the lights dimmed. The music faded. A spotlight struck the stage. The announcer's voice rolled through the ballroom, smooth and ceremonial, introducing me as founder of the Lighthouse Fund and chief executive officer of Whitmore Maritime Trust. I picked up the gray suitcase. Its broken zipper clicked softly in my hand. As I walked toward the stage, I saw my father push toward the front row, grinning like a man waiting to be thanked. My mother lifted a tissue to her eye. Sophie straightened, ready for applause that would never belong to her. They did not know they were not guests of honor. They were evidence. The applause began before I reached the podium. 500 people rose in a glittering wave of tailored suits, evening gowns, camera flashes, and expectant smiles. I placed the gray suitcase on the glass surface before me. Its frayed fabric looked brutally out of place beneath the white spotlight, like a wound set carefully on an altar. The room quieted. I looked down at the front row. Richard was clapping hardest. Elaine dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, performing motherhood for people who had never seen her abandon it. Sophie stood poised in her silver gown, chin lifted, already imagining her executive title, her office, her salary, her rescue. I adjusted the microphone. Tonight, I said, we gathered to talk about legacy. The word moved through the ballroom like a match struck in darkness. Legacy is not what we claim in public. It is what we leave behind when no one is watching. Sometimes it is a company. Sometimes it is a foundation. Sometimes it is a child standing alone in a bus station with a broken suitcase and no way home. Richard stopped clapping. I rested one hand on the suitcase. 10 years ago, on my 18th birthday, my parents drove me to a Greyhound station in Charlotte. They handed me this bag and a one-way ticket to Harrow Bay, Maine. My father told me I was no longer worth investing in. My mother asked me not to make it harder than it needed to be. My sister watched from the car and smiled. A sound moved through the crowd. Not a gasp exactly. Something colder. Recognition. Disgust. Judgment finding its shape. Elaine's tissue froze halfway to her cheek. Sophie's mouth parted. Richard's face tightened, color draining from his skin in slow degrees. I lifted the presentation remote. But abandonment was not the crime they were hiding. It was only the exit strategy. The screens behind me lit up. First came my credit report. 7 accounts. Loans. Cards. Equipment financing. All opened before I was legally old enough to sign them. The total glowed in red letters. More than $160,000. The ballroom went still enough to hear the rain ticking against the harbor glass. My parents stole my identity to keep a failing construction company alive, I continued. Then, the morning my adult credit file opened, they shipped me across state lines and hoped distance would bury the evidence. Richard lurched to his feet. Lies, he shouted, but his voice died before it reached the chandeliers. No microphone. No authority. No room willing to listen. I pressed the remote again. The next image appeared, Eleanor Whitmore's forged signature on an old loan guarantee, beside the practice sheets Miriam had preserved from archived litigation. My father built his first empire on a stolen name, I said. Then he tried to build his second on mine. This time, no one whispered. Cameras flashed. Journalists typed. Investors turned their faces toward Richard with open revulsion. The society he had spent his life worshipping was watching him become radioactive. I did not smile. The purpose of the Lighthouse Fund is simple, I said. We protect young adults from financial abuse by guardians who mistake blood for ownership. Tonight, Whitmore Maritime Trust is increasing its endowment to $5 million for emergency housing, legal representation, and tuition protection. The applause struck like thunder. Richard sank back into his chair. Elaine covered her face. Sophie stared at me as if I had broken a law by becoming unreachable. When I stepped off stage, they followed me into the private corridor exactly as I knew they would. You ruined us, Richard hissed, his tuxedo collar twisted, his eyes wild. No, I said. I documented you. Miriam handed him a black folder. His hands shook as he opened it. Page by page, the last illusion died. We owned his commercial debt. We owned the mortgage on his house. The liquidation order had been approved. The foreclosure notice would be posted in the morning. You have 12 hours to leave my property, I said. Elaine collapsed into a leather chair, sobbing that I was her daughter, that blood mattered, that family should forgive. You ended our family at the bus station, I said quietly. I am only honoring your decision. Sophie stepped forward, trembling with panic. What about my job? The memo said I was perfect for vice president of brand influence. For the first time all evening, pity touched me. Not enough to save her. Only enough to see how empty my parents had made her. There is no vice president position, Sophie. The memo was bait. You believed it because it told you what you wanted to hear. Her face crumpled. Security escorted them into the rain. Outside, beneath the awning, an aide handed Richard a white envelope. Inside were 3 one-way bus tickets to a cheap motel outside the city. Richard stared at them, then at the building he could no longer enter. The aide spoke softly. This is your gift. Do not come back. 6 months later, their names no longer opened doors. Richard's company was gone. Elaine's invitation stopped arriving. Sophie found work folding clothes in a store where no one cared who she used to be. Sometimes emails came. I deleted them unread. Not from hatred. From peace. On quiet mornings, I stand above the harbor with Eleanor's brass key in my hand and watch ships leave under a clean sky. I think of the girl at the bus station, cold, broke, and terrified. She thought she had been abandoned at the edge of the world. She did not know she had been pointed toward the tide that would carry her home. If Clara's story reminds you of a time you were underestimated, betrayed, or forced to rebuild yourself from nothing, share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may become the light someone else needs. And if you want more stories of betrayal, justice, and quiet power, like this video, subscribe, and stay with Still Waters Payback for the next one.